Well, what's up, guys? Ben here, bringing another video today from my parents' dining room. I guess this is what this is. I don't know. You see a bunch of family heirlooms in the back. It is what it is. Today, we're talking about two teams that I think are connected. Is the Battle of the North teams. And based on how roster mania went down this year, I have kind of made a couple transactions between each other. So let's talk about Minnesota and Toronto, how they conducted their business in the offseason, what I think the teams will do this season, where they stand. And I think at the end of the video, I'll probably tell you which team I think is going to be better this season. So let's dive in. We'll start off with Minnesota. All right. So let's talk about last season for Minnesota. So coming off of that crazy stage 5 major win in Cold War and then a decent showing at champs, they decided to run it back with the same team for the Vanguard season, and honestly, it did not go particularly well for them. Just never really got in form and ended up actually making a change halfway through the season, bringing in Cole Havoc for Major Maniac, who went off to a different squad. And then from there, still the same, just never really got going as a team, and unfortunately did not qualify for champs, which I think was a massive disappointment for a team that looked like they had a lot of promise going into the season. So taking a look at their stats from last season, shout out IOU Turtle as always for the spreadsheet, 500 in the win-loss, and they were a solid control team, 14-14, not bad. S&D was solid, but I think whereas a team, their ceiling was capped was around hardpoint. And once again, I think for like the third year really with Minnesota, they just weren't a good hardpoint team, all things considered. I think at the end of the year, these stats were kind of saved by how good they got at Bocage, sort of in the major 3, major 4 cycle. But outside of that, like 2-8 on Tuscan, 5-9 on Berlin, just like not going to cut it if they wanted to have qualified for champs, or at least an opportunity to win an event last season. And by the way, just to further demonstrate like that hardpoint record, I don't think really tells the story. They were 4-8 at the game mode in stage 1, 2-9 in stage 2. They had a pretty good showing in stage 3, 7-4, and then 7-6 in stage 4. So 500 and the last event, and at that point, like, by the way, like they really needed to make a hustle to try and qualify for champs, but a really poor showing outside of really stage 3 in the game mode throughout the season. And by the way, I should point out as well, when we look at the stage 4 stats, look at their win-loss by map. You'll see of the 7 wins, 5 of them are on Bocage. So just know they kind of figured that map out at the end of the season, which I'm not going to take any credit for. People told me at the beginning of last season that Bocage was going to be mixy and people wouldn't master it, but whatever, they were wrong again. So anyway, look, biggest takeaway from Minnesota is they had to do something about this roster. A lot of players were sort of in between contract at the end of the season. And so they had an opportunity to kind of cycle talent. I think bring in sort of a new core of talent. And I think the biggest question as well was what were they going to do with Attach, right? He was linked to a lot of different teams. So let's discuss. All right, so this is the team that they ended this season on, and they basically squad wiped this roster outside of Dylan. So Dylan, aka Attach, did end up re-signing with the team. Cole Havoc went back to Florida for the 59th time in CDL. Priestess did end up signing with the New York Subliners, and we covered that in the Vegas, New York video, if you haven't already watched that, in terms of my thoughts on that move. And then Standy actually ended up going off to Toronto, and we'll cover sort of him in the end of this video. Although I'll say about Standy, I think he was probably the player that disappointed the most on this roster last season after coming in Cold War, and I think really helping them out mid-season when they were lost. Last year, he didn't really play particularly well outside of his S&D numbers, which were really good in the beginning of the season. Free team with Dylan, and basically what Minnesota did is said, wow, we're got the Wolf family behind us. We want to build a winner. We want to build a culture of having that. Let's swing for the fences. So they brought in 3, I think, of the biggest sort of off-season targets. So they bring in Afro over from the London Royal Ravens, Cammy from Toronto, and Ben Vance from Toronto. So as I was alluding to in the beginning of the video, this is where some of the connection goes between Minnesota and Toronto, at least in the offseason. So let's talk about this lineup, where I think they are going to be good, where I think they may struggle. I think the strength for me on this team is I think there's a lot of understanding and experience on this team on how to kind of manage a full CDL season. I look at players like Dylan's been around for a really long time, won championships. Ben, been around for a long time, really won championships. Cammy now has been in the league on for 2 years on a Toronto team that I think does things the right way from a team management standpoint, at least with how they conduct the competitive team. And they have an opportunity to nurture a player like Afro, who really hasn't been on a contender squad, and he's got oodles and oodles of talent. And by the way, he's the sort of second strength of this team. Like, if they can figure out how to get the best out of Afro, like, this guy's unbelievable. The clips that we've seen from him the last 2 years on London, I think if you put this guy in the right environment, like the ceiling on this team goes dramatically. I think as well, Attach making the move to main AR permanently, because this is how this team is going to set up, I think is really good for Dylan's career, for how the team's going to play. So I see that there. You know, weirdly, a weakness for this team is I could see them being a little bit, have a sort of a funky start in S&D. I think it kind of remains to be seen what the S&D meta is going to kind of settle and be like, at least at the pro level. I haven't seen a lot of S&D practice or scrims or results out of that. So I think it's kind of an open question. Bant and Camby didn't have the best of times in S&D last season. I think Dylan's a good search player. And Afro is an interesting search player. I watch him play with London the last couple of years, and it's hard for me to really decipher like what their S&D system is and if he's just sort of free roaming or it's more of an Abizi thing, but I think he's still got a little bit of seasoning to get in S&D, but like his numbers are good. I think that maybe this S&D, as an S&D squad, they might have like a mixy start the season. I don't think they're gonna be a dominant top 3 team like right off the bat, but they can definitely round into shape there. And I think the other sort of area where this team may struggle is I think there's a lot of expectations on this team, more so the Toronto squad, and we'll get to that later in the video. Like, they've spent a lot of money on this team. The salary number on this team must be insane, and they haven't had, outside of that one weekend in Cold War, they really haven't had a lot of success. So I think there's pressure on this team to be solid early. You look at the coaching staff of Looney and Brian Saint and their history as coaches, at least in this team, and with Brian now over the course of a couple of years, hasn't been that great. And I know this is sort of a tough topic to talk about in videos, and I don't like to speak too much on people's features like that, but I do think if this team struggles, I think the coaching staff will be sort of the next question asked this team, as we've seen with like LAG and changes they made. If this team struggles, I think questions abound on what they want to do in regards to those persons and the rest of their staff. So right now, the coaches in the first coaches poll have Minnesota ranked 4th, as you see points wise. You know, Vegas 5th at 75, Toronto's on 77, and CL on 73, Optic on 72. The coaches have it pretty tight in that pack. To me, I kind of really see Minnesota definitely being right now on paper a top 4, top 6 team. I think they have the talent, I think they have the experience to do it, and I think they have the momentum, and I feel like they're going to manage what is a really different CDL kind of period right now. We're used to having CDL seasons that start in the beginning, the end of January as opposed to the beginning of December. Obviously in the CWL era, they started a little bit earlier, but we haven't had that in a couple of years, and there are a lot of new players in the league. But for many of these Minnesota players, they've been on that experience before, so they know how to manage what is essentially a really short boot camp period. And you kind of have the 2 weeks of matches, and then you're going to have the event. So I think Minnesota's going to manage that well and get off to a good start this season. And I actually think that they have the tools to really win an event this year, more so than other Minnesota teams in the past. Like, if they solve all game modes, which I think they can, I think they've got the tools to do it. So for me, I see this team, again, it's going to be hard for a team outside of like a FaZe or a Thieves to be consistent, or Optic as well, to be consistent like all top 4 all year. So they may bounce between that 4 and 6 window, but I see them as being a comfortable champs team. I see them as being a real contender, at least in 1 or 2 events this season, making it deep on a Sunday and having a chance to win a chip. And I would say they have a pretty good chance, I think, on paper to probably win one of those if they're in form. So I like the ceiling for Minnesota. I do think, though, if they get off to a slow start this season, we will see how this team reacts to some of that pressure around what I think are the sort of expectations. Because I don't think I'm the only one that's out here thinking that this team has got a good shot to win this year. So let's see how they do off the break. All right, to switch up a little bit, let's talk about the Toronto Ultra. So Cold War, great season. Had a couple of wins, came up short just at champs. Obviously, Major 5 was a heartbreaker as well last in Cold War. They ended up making really 0 changes going into the Vanguard season. Run it back. I thought that was a fair call. And they ended up winning Kickoff Classic. It looked like, once again, it was going to be them at the top, probably with like Optic and FaZe rounding out the top 3. And then from there, they never really had another like quality result. I think probably their best result as a team was the 3rd that they got at their own event, the Major 3. But it looked like Seattle was kind of the team destined to win that one. And FaZe obviously had another one of the million seconds that year. And so Toronto ended up kind of being the 3rd best team at that tournament. And they didn't play bad in Major 4 and champs, but they just weren't in that next tier. They had been sort of in the Cold War year. So a lot of questions then about the team in the offseason and what they were going to do. I think the thing that stands out, if you look at their stats from last season, again, shout out IOU Turtle for the sheet, is how horrible their hardpoint record was this last year. Like, really, like, surprisingly really poor on their end. 40% win percentage. They played a lot of hardpoint maps, again, because they went pretty deep in some of these tournaments, getting a lot of top 4 and top 6s. But man, 2-10 in Gava 2. They didn't have a single hardpoint map where they had a positive winning percentage. And it's frustrating because you look at like S&D and Control, they were like pretty solid in those game modes. They had a lot of series that went to game 5s, but their inability to take like the first map in a series or close it out on the fourth map, I think was a huge limiter on like their ceiling. And why, when they were competitive against all these teams, like they played tough series against LA Thieves, Optic, and FaZe throughout the year, they just couldn't close, I think, because of their weakness in that game mode. And I think like if you look at sort of by game win percentage, they only won 32% of their game ones, which is really poor. They did do a good job of winning those S&Ds, coming back, winning that control. And if they had lost, the first map or had lost one of the second or third, they did a decent job forcing game 5s. But they went 7-9 in game 5s last year, just falling short. And many of those heartbreaker losses, team just kind of lacked that something extra last season and the polish and hardpoint to really go deep. Right, so this is their team that they ended the season with. Let's take a look at the changes they made. Obviously, we already talked about Bance and Cammy. They were off to Minnesota, leaving Kleenex and Insight. And actually, the player who they had as their substitute last season, and he played like one match for them when a player got sick. Scrappy, I think Scrappy was always destined to kind of come to this team after how well he played in Challengers last year. They were really a team of 3 looking for one at that point. After it had been clear that they were going to move on for Ben and Cam. And they actually end up making a move I thought was a little surprising. One I don't think people expected sort of in the beginning of roster mania was to pick up Standy from Minnesota. I talked about it earlier in the video. Standy did not have the best of seasons last year in Vanguard. And so I don't think that options wise was extensive as it could have been if, say, he was a free agent after Cold War or something like that. But I actually really like the move for Toronto, and I think this is a natural segue to talk about where this team is good and where this team struggles. Where this team is good is I think there is a lot of really good speed on this team. We know how fast Standy plays. We know how fast Toby Kleenex plays, and those two players can be takeover players. If you've not watched a lot of Challengers last season or any of the stuff from the beginning of the season, Scrappy has the potential to maybe be a top 5 player in this game. I know it's early. That might be a hot take to some of y'all. Probably not if you've been paying attention. Because personally, I think that this guy, like, he has this sort of swagger and his game ability, the mechanics, communication's good. Like, I think he's got the package to come in the league as a rookie and immediately be a massive impact player. Right now, my front runner for Rookie of the Year, might even be an MVP candidate when it's all said and done. But I think you look at those 3 players and how they line up in front of Jamie Insight, who's a very good AR. This team is not going to be as methodical of sort of the past round teams with Cammy and Bance. I think this is way more of a speed team, more of like an LA Thieves phase type build than their old teams in the past. And I think that may set them up to be a little more successful in hardpoint. And look, I know you might say, well, what about these hardpoint KDs? Keep in mind, again, I think this is very much influenced by the fact that Kleenex was entry on the team last year and they weren't a great hardpoint team, and Standy as well, not on a go hardpoint team either last year. So don't read too much, I think, into that stat line. I think another strength for this team is they are on paper a disgusting S&D team. Like, once again, this team should be there or thereabouts in S&D top 3. Like, their ability to play for picks, play for speed, execute, someone snipes, obviously assuming that snipers don't get G8 or whatever. I like this team's ability to play search in this game, at least the way it's played. So this team should be another dominant S&D squad again. Where I think this team may struggle is in 2 areas. One is sort of chemistry between Standy and Kleenex on the routes that they want to take on the map. Now they play off each other as subs. I think that's a solvable problem, but again, that's just new teammate sort of gelling. I think they'll sort of figure that out with time. But watching, from what I've seen of footage of them playing other teams at times, it seems like that spacing sometimes gets a little bit confused. And it seems like those players don't really know how they want to work off each other. But I think they'll solve it within a couple of weeks. It may just be a little bit bumpy for the first 2 weeks before Major 1. I think the second potential weakness for this team is they did kind of get a huge loss in their coaching staff. And I think that on that end, the prep work is a little bit of a question mark for me. If you look at this sort of sheet right here, you'll notice that Mayhem is gone, Marky B is gone. So from a coaching staffing standpoint, they currently do not have an announced head coach. Now, from what I've heard, it's probably going to be one of your mainstay European veterans who competed a long time ago. I've heard a couple of names linked, so we'll see who they end up announcing on that front. But I think that's, again, a big question mark for me is what kind of impact and culture that coach is going to set, as opposed to Mark and the sort of success that he brought to this team now over at LAG. The coaches have Toronto on the same number of points as Minnesota, 77. I don't know how then Breaking Point decided who was 3rd and who was 4th, but whatever. I mean, I kind of agree with this assessment from the coaches. Actually, I'm reading it right now, and it says that Toronto edged out Minnesota thanks to 2 first place votes and 2 second place votes. So there you go. That's why they're third, I guess. For me, I think that this ranking seems pretty fair. Just like in Minnesota, I think their floor is pretty high. Like, I think top 8, top 6, top 8 team, even if, teams like New York play better in an event, or surprisingly, I think Texas is like 7th on this list. So, we'll talk about that when we get to their video. But I think top 6, top 8 is crowded. But this team has a lot of tools, I think, to really be a contender. And to me, the real X factor on where they get at that level is what version of Standy do you get? And is Scrappy going to come in and just be like that guy? I think they are set to do both those things right now. So I'm expecting big things from Toronto early. I'm expecting them to get out of groups and be a factor throughout the weekend at Major 1. And Toronto right now on paper, outside of Thieves and FaZe, is probably one of my favorites to win Major 1. I just think for a young team like this, they're coming in with a lot of energy and momentum. Scrappy comes to my chat all the time, bro. This guy's got a chip on his shoulder with every person and team in the league. I think this guy is going to bring the passion. I think that's something they needed with Cammy and Bance and that leadership leaving and just sort of a new sort of vacuum of culture that they needed to build around the squad. So I like what Toronto is bringing this year. I think they're going to easily qualify for champs, and they're easily going to contend for events. Again, there might be an event or two where they get top 6 or top 8. That's what happens in the CDL. But I think on most Sundays, they're not at events, you're going to probably see this Toronto team there competing for the title. I said in the beginning of this video, I will let you know between Toronto and Minnesota, who I think is a little bit better. Honestly, I think Toronto, for me, probably has the highest ceiling. I think in terms of consistency, it's possible Minnesota might beat them, but in terms of their ability to maybe win an event, I think Toronto just has more about them from a skill standpoint. I think Standy is kind of the tiebreaker on that for me, along with Scrappy, because I think Standy's ceiling, when he's played his best, if he can unlock that, I think he's an amazing player. And Scrappy, I think, is going to come in and dominate. So that's where I'm thinking. But you let me know in the comments. Do you think Minnesota is maybe better? Do you think they're going to place a little bit higher this season? Maybe want a chance for the higher seed and maybe get the better placing at the end of the season. Let me know what you guys think. As always, like if you enjoy the content. We got a couple more of these update videos, season preview videos coming for you over the next couple days as we get ready for the Major 1 cycle to start on December 2nd. So be on the lookout for all of that content. And as always, guys, we will see you on the next video.